Hey, I'm Veronica from UXPressia. Let me briefly introduce you to what we at UXPressia do. UXPressia is an online platform where you can build customer journey maps, impact maps, and personas for your organization. With more than 100 ready-to-use templates, you can speed up your persona creation and mapping processes. To help you build confidence on your journey and learn from other practitioners, we host community events on user, customer, employee experience, and all things journey mapping. Our speakers are industry experts that are willing to share their knowledge to help you design and build better products and services. We also speak at the events ourselves and share tips and tricks we learned through years of practice and numerous interviews with other mappers. On top of that, we have UXPressia Academy, where you can dive into learning how to build journey maps, personas, and conduct interviews. And do that all at your own pace. Don't forget to check it out and enjoy the event.
So with everything we're going to talk about today about building out a journey map, there's four key questions I want to answer. One of them being, how can we research the employee journey considering employees might be uncomfortable sharing? As someone mentioned, they've done some customer journey maps, and there are going to be some key differences between the two. Another is, how do we turn the employee journey map into actionable steps? Number three is, how can organizations measure the effectiveness of their employee journey mapping initiative? And number four is, what KPIs should you use? So there are going to be a few questions I'm going to ask the chat throughout the presentation. I have about a handful of them. So I know someone mentioned earlier that they done customer journey maps. So there is, of course, a lot of overlaps between the two, but there are the key differences. When it comes to customer journey maps, getting feedback from customers, it's easy to obtain unfiltered feedback. You know, if your product sucks or people are having issues with it, they're going to let you know right away. It's much easier to get a lot of quantitative feedback. It's a lot easier to come up with KPIs to identify if your initiatives have been working or not. You know, it's pretty easy to tie things towards money, for example. With employee journey maps, there's always the issue of getting unfiltered feedback. You know, as I love to say, in a perfect world, that employees could be feel comfortable to share any kind of pain points or struggles they have. I have known people who have given kind of feedback at organizations and received consequences for it, whether later it came up during performance reviews or management gave them different looks afterwards. It is a reality, unfortunately. And there's a lot more ambiguity to measuring these kind of things in regards to journey mapping. It's a lot harder to put dollar values to it. So that's some of the things we're going to cover here today. So when it comes to journey maps, what I like to narrow them down to is about 10 steps on the potential journey map. Now, I typically focus on three key areas, one of them being onboarding, another being ongoing engagement, another around the area of performance planning, performance reviews, performance feedback. I do touch upon some of these others, such as learning and development or recognition, but I typically find when I work with clients, we're going to focus on one or two steps, or sorry, stages. And those typically are around, I'd say, ongoing engagement the most, then onboarding, then performance planning and review. So Veronica, I'm going to ask you to run that poll of what stages do you want to focus on in regards to employee journey mapping? If it's something you've done already or something you're thinking of doing. So when it comes to working on the journey map, and one thing I say it's important to focus on, say, stages, is sometimes when I work with clients, they could be pretty broad when I come in. They're like, okay, we want to redo our entire employee onboarding. I'm like, okay, great. You're a company that's pretty big, so that's going to be a little bit challenging. Or something like ongoing engagement for the entire company, which is like, oh, great that you guys want to work on that. But starting out with, let's get a little more specific, because that way it's a lot easier to make implementations, take small steps towards success, and much easier to manage. And sometimes I've had meetings where they're like, oh, the whole journey map, the whole entire journey. I was like, okay, well, that's great. You want to do that. Let's chunk things down and let's focus a little bit more. There's this great quote from the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley that nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change. So great it is to see some organizations who are super enthusiastic about improving their journey mapping or their entire employee experience. I'm like, okay, let's take small steps at first. More for map analogies. So we got the top left, we have the world map, because I'm from Canada. We got the top right for the Canada map. Then we get down to the province, state, county map, wherever it might be for you, it's provinces in Canada. And then where I'm in Vancouver, that is more specific. So I always tell companies, it's like, let's get focused more on that city map, because that map is always constantly changing. Or let's think about like a street view. That's what you want to focus on. So one thing I always talk with clients is, let's get specific on your focus. So let's talk about what department you want to focus on first. Length of tenure. Let's talk about their age range or their career length. Things that get a lot more specific of who you're talking about or who you're looking to tackle with this objective, as opposed to just everyone in general. Now, some of this gets more into personas, which I'm not covering in this talk, but example of client work I've done recently with clients is one of them. We decide to focus on the market or the onboarding for the marketing department. So we ended up talking with people of a tenure of about 3 to 9 months at the organization, people who recently went through. Another was focusing on ongoing engagement of quality assurance employees with a tenure of 3 to 4 years. They're having some issues at that point where people were going to other organizations. So they wanted to specifically find that range and see what kind of things we could work on to improve that retention and reduce that turnover. Another one would be focus on learning and development for those in finance from an age of 25 to 35. So they had this idea of people early on in their career, they want to get a better understanding of what's working and what's not working for their learning and development section. So with that, a quote from the poet Dante from the Divine Comedy is, "From a little spark may burst a flame." So my thing is, let's focus on something specific, take small steps at first, and then get that momentum, and then we could go into more and more. But for something a little more recent than, I think Dante is from the 14th century, You Can't Start a Fire Without a Spark from Bruce Springsteen from Dancing in the Dark. So one key question we brought up earlier of the 4 was, how can we research the employee journey considering employees might be uncomfortable sharing? We get into these situations where, like I said, in a perfect world, employees would have no issue sharing kind of their challenges. But unfortunately, that's not true. As I mentioned earlier, people have had blowback as a result of being critical of their organization when that company should have been listening. So I find there's three options I recommend to organizations. One being hire an outside party like myself. 2 would be anonymous surveys. And 3, of course, would be conducting the internal interviews yourself. So the benefits of hiring an outside party like me is bringing in someone like me, you can help avoid issues of employees being uncomfortable in sharing information. Having that outside party, it makes it a lot easier for them to share things, more like it's a customer journey map, where it's a lot easier to get that customer to share information. It's something I specialize in, is employee journey mapping. So you bring in an expert, you help put food on my table if you do decide to hire me. Of course, there's always the issue of, you need to go through the process of finding an outside party, vetting them. there is some time required to get used to, like if you bring in someone like myself, to get accustomed to your organization. I've been in interviews with employees where I'm getting some feedback from them, and they're bringing up all these acronyms. And many times throughout the interview, I have to be like, okay, what do you mean by this acronym? Because I'm not familiar with them. Another one you can do is anonymous surveys, with the benefit of it being, well, anonymous. And it's a lot more scalable to do compared to conducting one-on-one or group interviews. Now, to be clear, I rarely do group interviews unless companies want me to. I always vouch to do one-on-one interviews. Now, there is the issue when you just do an anonymous survey, something they could just send and fill out. It's hard to really dig deeper into answers given. I'm going to go into a bit about why you want to go deeper than the answer they give you at face value. And there's other aspects as well where you can't really pick up on body language, someone's tone of voice, word emphasis. It's a lot more difficult to see what people mean. If people say something sucks, then that's going to be a lot different if it just says it in words, as opposed to someone like with the way they express it with their body language, their tone of voice. Why do I prefer one-on-one more? There's one reason is I find without others around, there are benefits to group interviews. Someone might mention something that sparks something in someone else. But I find with one-on-ones, it's easy to just focus on one person and just have like, there's no one else around them that might be impacting their answers. Like, for example, if like their manager was in the room, that might change some things. And then of course, there's the internal interviews. This is where you decide, like, as a company, you know what, we're going to do this ourselves. So of course there's convenient. Of course you have strong knowledge base of your organization. Like, if, as opposed to bringing someone like me in, you don't really have to go through that process of explaining how everything works here, what all the acronyms means, what's the layout of the organization. But of course, going with this approach, it's a lot easier to fall into biases, right? One thing I always tell companies, if you go with this approach, that's fine, but you want to avoid seeking out the answers you want to hear instead of what you need to hear. So it's very easy to fall into those biases, both from interviewing employees and them giving their feedback back to you. That biases might show up where you end up hearing answers you want to hear instead of should hear. And of course, as I mentioned a couple of times already, that employees may feel possible consequences for their answers, right? This gets tied back to, oh, so-and-so said this, that makes them seem like they really shouldn't be here. And I hate to see that happen, because I have talked to friends who have found consequences of being open about something that was a bit of an elephant in the room, which is something that's terrible to see. So avoiding these issues, of course, I will admit a bias to this. Hiring someone like me or any kind of outside party does help avoid a lot of these issues, along with getting the expertise of how to do the journey map. But if you do want to do more the internal route, you don't want to use their direct manager. This is where I recommend, if you have someone from the PNC team, get them to do the interviews, as long as it's someone who's not really directly tied to the individual you're interviewing. So now this is where I get more to the meat and potatoes of the talk, is what do I do with the interview process? And how do I put it all together into something that can be shaped into a journey map? So there's 3 key questions of what questions to ask, how many interviews should we conduct, and then of course, what do we do with all that information? So I have a list of about, I'd say 10 to 15 questions I have on hand in any kind of interview. It doesn't matter, like the company, the role, the size. Questions that help really dig into things about their experiences. And I've narrowed them down here to 5 of them. Tell me about some of the more memorable days or projects you have had in your role. 2 would be, was something you know that you wished you knew when you began your role. Number 3, which I have highlighted and underlined here, is I love this question, is if you had a magic wand to change anything in your role, what would you change? 4, what's something you wish your manager knew? And 5 would be, what are your favorite aspects about your role? Which ones would you rather not deal with? Any kind of these questions work really well in any kind of situation to get the ball rolling. So I do want to ask people to type in the chat, are there any kind of questions that you like to ask in these kind of interviews? Do any pop up into mind of what's a good question that we could ask to dive deeper into what an employee is experiencing? One thing I want to bring up about these questions is things to avoid. So when you're having these conversations, you want to avoid railroading. And what I mean by railroading is, setting things along a path of the answers you're looking to get. Again, that brings up the point of what what you want to hear versus what you need to hear. For example, I was talking with someone about their culture, and they brought up the point of, oh, we have a very fluffy culture. And that's something we dug into for like nearly the hour. I usually have about hour-long interviews with people, but that was something really interesting to get into. Of course, trying to avoid the yes or no questions, unless you need to just clarify a few things. And something that's very important I want to emphasize more than anything is this list of questions I've shown you, and everyone in the chat brought up a lot of really excellent questions, is you don't want to just go through them like one by one, like a checklist, and say, okay, I answered this, I got them to answer this question, this question, this question. And the key thing here as well is don't just get an answer and not explore it further, where that's where you're just going at face value. So what I mean by that is, if we're diving in like that question I brought up earlier, the question I love more than any other to ask is, if you had a magic wand to change anything in your role, what would you change? For example, if someone said, I wish, this is something I've heard in some of these interviews, is, I wish that upper management had a clue of what we did. And then I wouldn't just be like, okay, let's move on to the next question. I'd be like, okay, that's very interesting. Why is that the case? And I know someone brought that up earlier as well. So what I want to ask chat is, for your current role you're in, I want you to just type in chat about like 1 or 2 sentences. If you had a magic wand to change anything in your role, what would you change? Now, here's another thing I get asked a lot. It's like, well, how many interviews do we need to do? It's like, do we need to do dozens? Do we need to do, hundreds? How do you figure out what works? So there's really great study found by Nielsen Norman Group of really all you need is usually it is 5 users or 5 interviews to get feedback. Just 5. And I find this works. Once I discovered this was a game changer for me, because it made my life a lot easier. I could also go to clients and be like, oh yeah, we just need to typically talk to 5. The reason for that is patterns are going to begin emerging. Typically, I find, and this works so often is the case, of if there's an issue, like someone mentioned someone mentioned like red tape, too many clients, if that's coming up several times, if I'm going to be doing 10, 12, 15 interviews, they're probably going to be saying the same thing. Now, depending on a few factors, and there's 2 of them mostly, if you can't find any patterns after 5 emerging, either it's a case of, well, 1, you need to conduct more interviews, or 2 is going back and getting more specific of what of who you're talking to and the areas you want to focus on. There was a client I worked out with a few months ago where we had a department, and we decided, it's something we should have separated out earlier, is there was like managers and there's also more like the frontline staff. But instead we did under one umbrella. So there's different answers, patterns emerging with managers, different ones merging with the frontline staff. So, but when you mesh them together, there weren't really those patterns, but it became something that we got them separate. We ended up doing more of a journey map more for two different areas for it because they had very different experiences. So the further you get in with your interviews, they're more for confirmation, I find. Where if you're doing if you've gone through 3 interviews and performance reviews is something that's come up a lot, or day one onboardings come up with a lot, you can start to guide the conversation a bit to confirm your findings so far. Be like, oh, tell us about day one onboarding, for example, if you're finding that's a pain point. Again, you don't want to railroad the conversation to kind of force that answer out of them. But it's something that once you get further in, you could have more of a structured interview, I find. But this rule works very well, assuming you get specific in the areas you want to target, and who you're talking to. So what do you do with all this information? So on the right here, I don't take physical stickies. I know some people do. When I do my interviews, I do have sheets of paper, and I take notes. And pretty much everything now, of course, with everything that's happened the last few years, everything I do is pretty much all virtual. So I find it very easy to record. I rarely have issues of permission for people recording. Um, Usually when I get brought in with a company, it's more for my purposes only to view it afterwards for notes. There might be some people within the organization who sees it, but it's more for me to go back after and be like, if I missed something or I want to go back. And what kind of things do you want to make note of is you got to really notice those powerful language and statements. For example, I mentioned earlier, someone mentioned that, oh, we have a very fluffy organization. Like fluffy is a very interesting term to describe it. So I kind of, I very much circled that answer over and over and really dug in from there. Now, looking at these sticky notes on the right, this is how many kind of I typically find. This is not a picture I took myself, but these are the amounts that I could get after a while, after several interviews. So I use a tool like whether like a digital whiteboard tool. I use Miro. I'll go after the interviews, I'll go down and write them down in Miro, just get various stickies down, 1 to 2 sentences of something that someone said, like I have examples here, like a team receiving more recognition, struggling to find the value of the ad, maybe the performance review is too broad in its focus. I'm not at that point, I'm not really focused too much on organizing them at first. It's more about just getting it down on the board. And then as time goes on, then you could kind of start seeing those patterns like, okay, day one onboarding comes up a lot. Let's sort the stickies around that. Performance reviews come up a lot. Let's sort the stickies around performance review around that. Same thing for career development. And then that's where you get more into making the journey map itself. Now, there's many different ways you could do a journey map. I don't think I have it included, but if, for example, with UXPressia, they have a very thorough employee journey map template, which they have numerous rows of things like storyboarding and emotions. I typically get my areas down to about 5, like 5 rows for me. And that's employee goals and expectations, employee experience and emotions, 3 being moments that matter, 4 being the pain points, and 5 being opportunities for improvement. Now, for examples, I brought up day one onboarding, I brought up career development, I brought up performance review. This is something like it could look like on a more summarized journey map. Now, when you're at this point in the when you're mapping it out, this is where it becomes a lot more summarized information. This is where you start to, and which I'll talk about shortly, make it more anonymous. You don't want to have things tie back to an individual. So employees' goals and expectations, that's kind of what they're, of course, what they're expecting. So if it's day one onboarding, of course, they want to make a good first impression. They want to get things off to a good start. Employee experience and emotions. This is more, I find a lot of those statements that I brought up earlier, those can start to pop up here. Moments that matter. Now, this is something some people have come back to me and like, I don't really understand what you mean by moments that matter. These are really what I find that are notable moments, whether good or bad, brought up during interviews. Like specific, this comes up a lot with one question, which is, tell me about one of your more memorable days at the organization, or tell me about one of your more memorable projects. Things that really stand out to them, whether good or bad. It's easy for them to tie back to something. For example, for someone going through a day one onboarding, they love that their manager took them out for lunch. They seemed excited for me to start working there. That was a very positive moment that matters. One that'd be more negative would be, things came up during the performance review that should have been discussed with my boss months ago. Like that's one of those moments that sticks out to an employee as a negative experience. So what I want to ask you in the chat here is, in your current role, I want you to think about a moment that mattered to you, whether that was good or bad. And just one or two sentences, just type it out. For example, past experiences, I remember for the first 3 months of an organization, we had 3 lunches with the executives, which was about the new employees. There's about a cohort of 5 of us. And that was really great to get to know the executives, but also for them to get to understand what's working and what's not working for us. One thing I brought up as well is when I go through and put together the journey map, I do anonymize my findings. So things that don't really tie it back to a certain individual. And what I mean by that is I've had experiences during interviews where people bring up things that are very much, I would say, like edge use cases where they've had experience that to them was completely unique. That would have made it, if I wrote it down on the journey map, it would have been clear who said that. And I always do what I can to make sure that their voice is heard. So when that person goes back and reads it, they know that's them. But also to the fact that it can't get really tied back to them within the organization. That's kind of my promise I want to do, is make sure they're heard, but make sure it doesn't get tied back to them directly. So there's, of course, a lot of things that you could cover in regards to, like, this is where you get into the columns, like the activities that you want to dive deeper into. For example, like I have some here, like day one onboarding, the first 90 days, of course, would fall under onboarding. Getting more into learning development, you get career development, learning and development opportunities, performance reviews, recognition from manager, work-life balance, remote work. There's so many things that you could focus on, or things that come up during these conversations. So usually I go in where it's like, all right, well, I know this is this company's employee engagement process, but let's see what people bring up during conversations. It ties in a lot to, maybe recognition, or might tie a lot to their work-life balance or their workload, or if it's onboarding, how was the first 90 days like for them? There is no right or wrong answer to this, but I always recommend is the more specific you get, the better, because it's much easier to get into. And which leads to the next point of the 4 key questions. That was the main one, was covering kind of the meat and potatoes, a very quick overview of the things I cover with how to do the interview and get that information. But another one is, okay, so you have all this information, how do we turn this into actionable steps? So one of the reasons I love the magic wand question, might not give you the answer right away, but if you dig more into it, it gives possible solutions brought up during the interviews. If Someone mentions that they're feeling isolated. I saw that mentioned in the chat. Someone mentioned like we feel real, really siloed off. We feel isolated from other teams. One thing and I've had come up in these in interviews is someone's like, oh, you know what? I love if we had more, organized events where we could interact with other teams. And one solution I always love to, I find it's very easy to implement. It comes up a lot is something like if your organization has a buddy system, have more than one buddy. I always recommend it's like have someone beyond just their team be a buddy, and that helps really paint a bigger picture of the organization. But of course, a lot of this is going to come up to you to take that feedback you get and come up with possible solutions for the given pain points. So when it comes to coming up with solutions, people are like, well, Paul, how do we come up with solutions? I love this quote from Leonard Cohen of, if I knew where the good songs came from, I'd go there more often. So what I mean by that is really the best thing moving forward is, it's like the sticky note approach as well, is conduct a brainstorming session to come up with ideas. Run those ideas you've had interviewed for feedback. Send out, this is something where you can even do like those surveys, so you could scale up more, scale up those surveys to collect feedback. So, people are mentioning again, like the isolation factor from other teams, come up with more team-based events or more in-person events, or, have a buddy system. So, and then kind of you could get feedback from individuals to find those. So this kind of leads us more to our last two major ones, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. So I am going to bring them up together. Is how can organizations measure the effectiveness of their employee journey mapping initiative, and what KPI should use? As I mentioned earlier, it's a lot more vague than customer journey mapping, which that one's a lot easier to tie like, oh, revenue towards, or something that's a lot easier to get that. It's a lot more, it's harder to measure. And of course, for measuring the effectiveness, a lot of things are going to take some time to see results. Like you're not going to really see results exactly like tomorrow, next week. You want to think more, over quarters or fiscal year. And this is where you want to be more specific in your focus. If you're saying the overall employee journey, if you want to do that, it gets difficult to see what's making the difference. So getting more specific, that's like where I mentioned, if you're focusing on a department with people from a tenure of 3 to 5 years, and you want to focus on employee engagement, you're going to be able to see the results a lot more because you have a more specific idea of what you've laid out and what you need to work on. Then we get more into KPIs, and this is something that I'm going to bring up to chat as well. What kind of things that you could look for, like employee satisfaction, whether, that comes during performance reviews, whether that comes from, again, that ties in with pulse surveys. Are people finding that they're, I guess it ties in with NPS. Are they recommending, are those scores going up of recommendations as a result? Or an easy one, of course, is employee retention. If, for example, you built like you focused on your onboarding. Onboarding plays a huge role in employee retention. Have you found those retention rates are going up? For example, learning and development, do you find those course completion rates are going up? What kind of things are kind of KPIs? Oh, NPS is, what does it stand for? Net Promoter Score. So that's like on a scale, is it like 0 to 10? Is like how I know for like products is usually how likely are you to recommend this product to someone else. For internally, it would be more how likely are you to recommend, it's the wording I'm looking for. What's your likelihood of recommending someone join the organization? If you told a friend, like if they're like, oh, should I join your company? What would you say to that? So that's a very, very quick overview of kind of the process of how I put together, a journey map, in a very, very short time frame, mostly focusing on what I talk about during the interviews, how many to interview, what I do with that information. So I know before we get to the Q&A here, with everything I've discussed so far and everything you brought up in chat, like what's one small step you could take moving forward after this? Whether that's, checking out UXPressia templates, whether that's having a meeting with someone about journey mapping, whether that's starting to conduct interviews with employees, whether that's reviewing engagement scores. So now as we go to the Q&A here, so just if you want to reach me, I know Veronica will send this out afterwards too, but my email, my website. I do have a very long blog post about employee journey mapping that goes much more into depth with things. LinkedIn's the best way to contact me. And if you send me an invite, just also mention mention this event. And that way, sometimes I'll get invites from people. I'm like, where'd you come from? Like, I don't see like many connections or anything, but just mention in the message that this is where, if you want to connect, that you came to this event.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, your ideas, your views. I believe that it was super helpful for everybody. Now, yes, exactly. Let's move to Q&A. So let's start with the first question. What do you do with insights that suggest change is needed around culture, such as top-down hierarchical culture is the biggest driver of employee dissatisfaction and hindering performance?
Ooh. Can you repeat the question again?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
What do you do with insights that suggest change is needed around culture?
Ooh. That's one of those things where, again, it's like very, very broad focus. Again, that's where you're going to have to narrow it down more, where that focus. I think you mentioned something there about, like you said, where the higher level where there's a lot of.
There was a second part of it, like an example, such as top-down hierarchical culture is the biggest driver of employee dissatisfaction and hindering performance.
Yeah. Yes, that's very.
Still broad?
No, that's much better. But no, what I'm saying, that's a very common one that comes up. Like, I think more than any other, whenever I do insight, a lot of it comes down to, there's this huge gap in between what management thinks or executives think and what actually happens down below. So again, it's breaking that down further and figuring it out why that's the case and bringing up examples. I have people like, well, can you give me examples of times when you felt this, where it's like, management said something that clearly made them seem out to lunch, or, we basically are always on reactive mode because management will just throw things at us without rhyme or reason. A lot of it really comes down to the communication gaps that happen with management, where a lot of it, where I do end up talking to management. It's like, you guys need to do something better about communicating, being transparent. A lot of it comes down to the whys. It's like, okay, if you're saying they need to be working on this now, they might understand it, but employees don't. And that does add up, right? Where if employees don't have a kind of a set idea of what value their work contributes to an organization, that plays a big factor of like, issues that they have with the organization. So I find that is very common amongst, like I said, the upper management. Is a lot of it is going to come down to communication and really being more clear about why they've decided the things they do. Sometimes management will be like, okay, we're doing this. Okay, why? And then it's like they roll their eyes or like, and then it gets very fluffy. And there's that word again, fluffy. I hope that kind of gets the thing. But that again, that's a very That's a very daunting question that that comes up a lot. Town halls do a great job of addressing it, I find. Some people have mentioned that. That's helped them a lot.
Thank you, Paul. Also, you did mention some solution on turning the employee journey map into actionable steps. And Jay here has a question. Will the solutions be product-centric, program-centric, internal messaging, or communication norms?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yes, you did mention some solutions on turning the employee journey map into actionable steps.
Yep.
And Jay has a question. Will the solutions be product-centric, program-centric, or maybe internal messages or communication norms?
I find communication is usually the one that pops up the most, I find. Yeah, a lot of issues. I mean, some will there might be some cases where I find like products and whatnot are more what do I say, like byproducts or programs. For example, I know there are some like software services that help with, buddy systems or whatnot, but that's kind of a further step down. It's more taking it more to the communication aspect first. A lot of stuff isn't really anything where it's like, oh, we need this new product or we need this new pilot, I would say, for running things. A lot of it does, again, come down to communicate. My findings, yeah, it's typically communication. And it makes it a lot easier to kind of get those first steps going towards the right direction.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question here. I believe that's a difficult one, right, for right now. Can you show us more examples of EGMs and share action that was taken from them?
Well, that's can't really share. Some stuff's tied behind NDAs, but I could definitely, if someone wants to reach out to me afterwards, like just with the time limit, right? I could be happy to share with them more. And of course, also, like you said, with UXPressia, there's the templates. What was the second part of the question?
If you can share any action that was taken from those journey maps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. There was a lot more tightening up of performance reviews. Some companies started to do more move to like biannual performance reviews. They start to get more specific. Better recognition systems, I find, is a big one. More one-on-ones with their managers. Implementing a buddy system that was beyond just their team. Going more with getting buddies from other people, from other teams. That does a great job in helping deal with some of that silo issues. Recommending to management more to do set schedules for communication. Sometimes even it's just a one pager saying, hey, here's what we're going to be working on. This is why we're doing it, can do wonders. Onboarding, anything from like helping structure out a day one process to kind of getting those first 90 days. Setting up like an entry interview of getting to know the individual. Those are some of the common things that have come up of solutions.
Thank you, Paul. This one I like. The next question. How often should employee journey maps be reviewed?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. As often, I like to say as often as possible. And I see someone in the chat, I think, mentions like, does a lot of this work and insight just sit in the drawer somewhere? Well, that's always the potential. Or bringing back the map analogies, I do like to say to companies is like, keep this up on the wall somewhere and think about your map. And that's where I use the analogy to begin with as well, where, you have the world map, country maps, province maps, city map. World map doesn't really change a whole lot. Country maps, maybe every once in a while will change, but it's more, right? If you look at a city level, right? If you go Google Street View, things are always changing, right? Businesses are coming in, new buildings are being built. So it's not like a one and done thing. It's something that's why where it's helpful if you have it up on the wall, like a map. You could see like, okay, it's time to review this again, see how things are working. ideally, like it's maybe like every quarter or so, it's something that'd be nice to go back to and see what works and what doesn't. As I mentioned, some things will take some time to see results. But it's not like something you just want to bury in a desk, right? Yeah. So my answer, kind of feels like a cop-out answer, but it's like as often as possible. Um, but thinking of it more like I said, a Google Street View map where things are always kind of changing. Um, that's a good way of thinking about it.
Thank you. As we usually say here in UXPressia, we're not building a map just for the sake of a pretty picture. It should work.
Yeah.
The next question is, how do you motivate people to take part in surveys? Sometimes the response rate is quite low, or it's always the same people that participate.
Yeah. Because usually with how it works is when I get brought in for a company, I'm like, I say like, we figure out who we want to interview. And they themselves will generate the list. Sometimes they just put the word out there and they'll collect some. It's not really I guess it's hard for me to answer because it's never really been a struggle on my end. I guess it's more for those who bring me in, right? So yeah, like you said, there might be people who are very vocal about things. But then this is again where you want to get specific, but if you get too specific, then again, you might end up with about like 3 people potentially. There are various things like, you know, the way of the wording of it, like, oh, this can help you implement better culture for the organization. If you ever even you could do, I know some companies have done like gift cards or something. I didn't agree with this, but one company is like, oh, like we'll bring it up during performance review that they did this. So it's like, well, I like to keep that feedback anonymous, but that is something you could just say like, oh, they did help implement some or recommend some changes to certain things, as long as they make it anonymous. But that one's harder for me to answer, I find, because it's typically, I haven't had many issues with companies where I'm like, okay, we've narrowed down who we want to talk to, and it's usually in their hands to send it out. So that one unfortunately is a bit more difficult for me to answer. But if anything from, you know, it's something that could be brought up as a positive in performance reviews, whether it's a gift card or even just saying like, hey, have a chance to vent about certain things.
Thank you, Paul.
Someone mentioned cupcakes. I like that too. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Or even like, yeah, take them to a coffee shop nearby and it's on the company, right? So.
Or a cocktail bar, as someone was mentioning before.
So I mentioned might be a little harder to record those kind of interviews, but that's okay.
Yes,
that's also a thing where I say it's also easier for me to record interviews because it's pretty much I always do them over Zoom. So that is something I do have to bring up, where it's unless you're doing like Zoom interviews at your company, it's a little more difficult to do.
And we have time for like 2 questions. The first one is, any suggestions for employee satisfaction questions besides NPS?
There's one I've seen come up where it's like, on a scale of like 1 to 5, how likely do you see yourself at this organization within like a year or 2 years, 3 years? That's one I think that's worked quite well for some organizations I've talked with when they're identifying beyond just NPS, just getting like the recommendations, is if you're finding like those scores are going up where people are more likely to be staying longer, that's obviously a good sign.
Thank you. And the last one for today, and I love this question actually. How do you guide companies towards taking actionable steps after mapping the employee journey?
How do I
guide the companies?
Yeah. Sometime it's been funny. Sometimes I'll get brought in and where I basically just map it out. It's like, Okay, well, it's up to them. I always, even this is more, I get more, that would be more into design thinking afterwards. We'll be like, let's sit down and let's really go over these solutions. Some companies are just like, we just want the map. I'm like, well, let's go over what we could do afterwards. And that's really, of course, sitting down with the findings, but a lot of it gets more into the solutions. And I bring a lot of solutions to the table. Like, so we went through all these findings. Here are some things I recommend. I also recommend that we sit down together and we brainstorm things out here. So I know it's common, for example, if you bring in like an outside party or consultants, you get all this information and it's kind of like, all right, see you later. So I always make sure it's like, all right, depending on the scope of the project, let's keep me around afterwards. And then this is, I always recommend, it's like, let's go through this of how we could implement. It's great you brought me in for the map, but let's make sure we take things from that map and make it into reality. So a lot of it's going to come down to, I'd say a lot of it is brainstorming sessions work really well. Like once you have all that information, it's like, okay, what can we do? That's where I bring up that quote again of if I knew where those good ideas came from, I go there more often. Employers are going to bring up a lot of good ideas. Brainstorming is going to bring up a lot of good ideas. One thing I should really mention is any kind of solutions that come up, don't get married to them right away. And what I mean by that is it's very common when you do these brainstorming sessions to be like, all right, we came up with all these ideas, and then we're only going to go with one to begin with. It's like, well, studies have found when companies have used that process of multiple ideas, it's usually they do best when they try a few approaches. So you could take baby steps of trying maybe 3 or 4 approaches to seeing what works and what doesn't.
And you mean 3 or 4 at the same time?
Sometimes I would say more like I mentioned, there's like surveys you could send out at that point. You could kind of get some more feedback there. But you could do like mini tests as well, where if you do want to run 3 or 4, maybe a little, well, yeah, you could do that. But I'm sure people have realized by now, I'm all about taking the kind of, I don't want to say baby steps, but more dipping your toe in the pool first before jumping in, to make sure you're on the right path. So that's kind of along the same lines here. Is like, you could just do some mini tests of just getting feedback from individuals. Like, here's 4 solutions we have. Like, what do you think about them?
If you want to see more events like this, make sure to check the upcoming ones at UXPressia.eventbrite.com or check the recordings we've got on this channel. Take care, and I will see you around.